The courtroom sat in ominous silence as Sean Diddy Combs, once the mogul of music and fashion, now sat in the defendant's chair. A towering figure in the entertainment industry, he was unrecognizable. The once charismatic, larger-than-life persona was gone, replaced by a man who appeared fragile, his face obscured by a veil of secrecy. Diddy, who had been known for his confidence, his self-assured public image, was now at the mercy of a legal battle that threatened to unravel everything he had built. The case had stunned the public. No one had expected it. Diddy, a name synonymous with success, power, and wealth, was facing accusations that seemed too vile to comprehend. The allegations were nothing short of horrifying. Accusations of sex trafficking, physical abuse, and, perhaps most disturbing of all, the existence of a torture room within the walls of his mansion. The room, according to the prosecution, was a place where young women were manipulated, tortured, and held captive in unimaginable conditions. As the prosecution began presenting evidence, the courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Each piece of evidence, each chilling testimony, further cemented the grim reality that Diddy had been living a double life, one that no one had imagined. The details that began to surface about the so-called torture room were enough to make anyone sick to their stomach. The prosecution's first witness, a woman whose name was hidden for her safety, described the room in haunting detail. She spoke of chains attached to the walls, thick leather restraints, and an overwhelming sense of dread that filled the air. She described the stark contrast between the opulent nature of Diddy's mansion, marble floors, gold accents, and extravagant furnishings, and the nightmare that unfolded behind closed doors. She had been brought into the room on numerous occasions, she claimed, forced to endure physical and psychological torment as part of Diddy's twisted regime of control. It was like a nightmare, she said. You could never escape. He'd make you feel like you were nothing, like you didn't matter. And no matter how much you begged, there was no mercy. The room was cold, she recounted, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the floor, making everything appear distorted. It was a space designed to break a person's spirit, to instill fear and subjugation. It wasn't just the physical abuse, though that was undeniably horrific. It was the emotional manipulation that Diddy had employed. The woman explained that Diddy didn't just control their bodies, he controlled their minds. He would tell them that they were worthless without him, that they would never be anything without his help. And when they attempted to leave, when they sought a way out, he would make sure they knew they were trapped, caught in a web from which they could never escape. As the woman's testimony continued, the courtroom was a mixture of disbelief and revulsion. There were gasps as the graphic details began to emerge. Diddy's face remained hidden behind his hands, the once proud man now a mere shadow of himself. His silence spoke volumes, his head lowered, as if he were incapable of facing the accusations that had been laid before him. The prosecution's case was meticulously constructed. They had gathered photographic evidence, pictures taken during a raid on Diddy's mansion, images of the chains, the restraints, the bloodstains on the floor. Each photo painted a picture of a man who had used his power to manipulate, control, and harm. There was no denying the existence of the torture room. It was a place of unimaginable suffering, and the evidence was damning. Diddy's defense team, however, was equally determined. They tried to discredit the victim's testimony, suggesting that she had fabricated the story for financial gain, that she was seeking attention in the wake of her failed career. But the photos, the physical evidence, and the corroborated stories of other victims told a different story. One by one, former associates, former lovers, and former employees took the stand. Each spoke of Diddy's reign of terror, describing how he manipulated people around him, controlling them with the promise of fame, fortune, and success. But Diddy's reach was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Another former victim, a young woman who had worked as one of Diddy's assistants, came forward. She explained how she had been introduced to the darker side of Diddy's world at a very young age. The assistant claimed that Diddy had promised her fame and fortune, promising to help her become a star. But as her career took off, she found herself trapped, caught in Diddy's web. She spoke of the pressure to comply, the fear that crept into every conversation, every interaction. He was a master manipulator, she testified. He would make you feel like you owed him everything. And when you tried to stand up for yourself, when you tried to leave, he would make you feel like you were worthless. He would use your dreams, your ambitions against you, making you think that you had no choice but to obey him. The woman described a specific instance where Diddy had coerced her into performing degrading acts, making her believe that it was all part of the price she had to pay for success. She also described the psychological toll it took on her, how, over time, she began to believe that she was nothing without him. He made me feel like I wasn't even human, she said, like I was just a tool he could use, discard, and replace whenever he wanted. As more victims came forward, Diddy's defense team began to struggle. The holes in their arguments were becoming increasingly apparent. They tried to argue that the testimonies were exaggerated, that the victims were seeking attention. But the evidence, both physical and emotional, spoke for itself. And as each victim spoke, the case against Diddy grew stronger. The jury sat in stunned silence as the gravity of the situation sank in. It wasn't just the physical abuse, it wasn't just the chains, the restraints, or the torture room itself. It was the fact that Diddy had used his power to prey on the vulnerable. He had taken advantage of young women who sought a better life, using their dreams against them to manipulate and control them for his own gratification. As the final witness took the stand, a former bodyguard who had worked for Diddy for years, the courtroom collectively held its breath. The bodyguard had been a silent observer of much of the abuse, complicit in his silence. But now, after years of living with the guilt, he was ready to speak. His testimony was chilling. He described how Diddy had used fear to control everyone around him, including his staff. The bodyguard revealed that he had seen the women being brought into the mansion, seen the fear in their eyes as they were forced to comply with Diddy's demands. He spoke of the twisted power dynamics that Diddy had created, how the women were made to feel that they were disposable, and how he had manipulated his entire entourage into believing that they were just as complicit. It wasn't just about control, the bodyguard said. It was about breaking them. He wanted to destroy them, to strip away every ounce of dignity they had. He enjoyed the power he had over them. The bodyguard's testimony was a turning point in the trial. It was the final piece of the puzzle that painted a damning portrait of Diddy's actions. He had used his wealth, his fame, and his status to manipulate and control, to break those around him. The jury had heard enough. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the final day of the trial arrived. The defense was running out of options, and the prosecution had presented a rock-solid case. Diddy, who had once been a household name, was now reduced to a shadow of the man he once was. His silence throughout the trial spoke volumes. His legal team, in their final attempts, argued that the charges were based on nothing more than hearsay and circumstantial evidence, suggesting that the victims were merely seeking revenge or financial compensation. But these claims were no longer enough to sway the jury. As the defense team made their closing arguments, Diddy remained stoic, his face still obscured, hidden from the world. He was no longer the media darling, the king of hip-hop, but a man on trial for the darkest of crimes. The reality of his situation had finally sunk in. His empire, once untouchable, was crumbling in front of him. The prosecutor, in his closing statement, summarized the trial with chilling clarity. He spoke of the victims, brave women who had been abused, controlled, and broken by a man who once stood at the pinnacle of success. He described how Diddy had used his influence to create a system of fear, where the victims believed they had no power to fight back. These women were not just prey, the prosecutor said. They were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. And this man, this so-called mogul, was the architect of their suffering. The courtroom fell into a deep silence as the prosecutor finished. Everyone knew the truth. There was no escaping it. Diddy had used his power and status for far darker purposes than anyone could have imagined. He had built an empire on the backs of those he had exploited. And now, the truth was finally being revealed. The jury deliberated for hours, each member weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and the emotional toll the trial had taken on everyone involved. The room was tense, as if time had frozen. Outside the courthouse, the world awaited the verdict with bated breath. The public, who had once revered Diddy, now stood divided. There were those who believed he had been set up, and there were others who could no longer deny the horrific truth. Fans on social media were angry, confused, and hurt by the revelation that someone they had looked up to for years had been hiding such dark secrets. After what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. The foreman stood up, holding the piece of paper that would decide Diddy's fate. His voice was calm, almost mechanical as he spoke. "We find the defendant, Sean Combs, guilty on all charges." Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the words sank in. The once invincible mogul had fallen. Diddy sat motionless, his face still hidden, as the weight of the verdict crushed him. The jury had spoken, and the world would never be the same. His empire was now in ruins, and the truth had come to light. As the judge ordered Diddy's arrest, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing as they tried to document the fall of a man who had once been at the top of his game. Outside the courthouse, news outlets were already broadcasting the verdict, with pundits and experts giving their takes on the case that had shaken the entertainment world to its core. Diddy's legal team attempted to remain optimistic, preparing for an appeal that they hoped would overturn the jury's decision. But it was clear that the damage had already been done. His reputation was tarnished beyond repair. The mogul, who had once been a symbol of success, resilience, and creativity, was now associated with the darkest aspects of human behavior. In the weeks that followed, Diddy's assets began to be frozen. His businesses came under investigation, and partnerships with major companies were dissolved. The brands that had once stood proudly behind him, those that had been willing to overlook any imperfections in exchange for his star power, now found themselves facing intense public pressure to sever all ties. His music career, which had once been the envy of the industry, seemed to be over. His fashion empire, his ventures in media, and his influence on the culture were now viewed with suspicion. Many artists who had worked with Diddy in the past began to distance themselves, uncertain whether they could continue to support the man whose crimes had been exposed for all to see. The victims, however, found some semblance of peace. While no amount of justice could ever undo the pain they had endured, the verdict brought them a sense of relief. Their courage in speaking out had opened the door to a broader conversation about the abuse of power in the entertainment industry. Women who had been silenced for so long were now finding their voices, using their stories to inspire others who had suffered in silence. They had fought not only for their own freedom, but for the freedom of others who had been too afraid to speak up. One of the victims, who had once felt trapped in the nightmare that Diddy had created, spoke publicly after the trial. Her words were raw and filled with emotion, yet there was a sense of strength in her voice. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person who has ever been made to feel like they were less than human, like their worth didn't matter. We have all been told for too long that we are nothing. But today, we showed the world that our voices matter." As the years passed, the trial of Diddy became a turning point in the entertainment industry. The revelations from the case forced a shift in how power dynamics were viewed, particularly the unchecked power held by moguls and high-profile figures. New policies were put in place to protect vulnerable workers in the industry, and a growing movement of women began to speak out against the abuse they had faced in silence for so long. For Diddy, the road ahead was uncertain. He faced years of legal battles, lawsuits, and a shattered reputation that could never be fully repaired. His empire, once untouchable, had crumbled. But despite his fall from grace, he remained a figure of intrigue, a man who had once commanded the respect of millions, now reduced to a cautionary tale. His name had become synonymous with scandal, his legacy forever tarnished by the truth that had been uncovered. The victims, on the other hand, moved forward, empowered by their ability to take back control of their lives. Their courage had shifted the narrative, and their strength had given voice to countless others who had been silenced for far too long. The world may have changed, but for them, the battle for justice was just beginning. Before you go, please hit like and subscribe right now for more update.